Hello, everyone. Kyle Broxterman here, one of your co hosts. Just here with a quick message before we dive into our episode. If you've been enjoying the show, please rate and review us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Also, consider sharing this podcast with your climbing friends. Word of mouth is one of the most powerful ways to help us out. One more opportunity. I recently printed 10 flyers to be placed around climbing gyms in the country. If you're interested in spreading the words of the climbing majority, just DM me on Instagram and I'll mail one to you. I already have 3 volunteers, so be sure to reach out quickly if you're interested. All right, that's it. Welcome to episode 14. Today we sit down with Max Lurie. Max is an AMGA certified rock and Alpine guide, as well as an accomplished alpinist. During our conversation, we cover topics like risk, social media, climbing hard, the path to obtaining knowledge, what it's like to hire a guide, how to prepare for an objective, and finally, how criticism and shame find its way even into a professional guide's DMs.
Yeah, awesome, man. Well, obviously it's so nice to have you here again and to see you and everything. And, really looking forward to our conversation today. I don't know. Why don't you just start off by telling us, who you are and why you're here today?
Yeah, well, I'm psyched to be here with you guys. My name is Max, and I'm a mountain guide. I live in Boulder, Colorado. I am an American mountain guide, certified rock and Alpine guide. I own my own company. It's called Alpine to the Max, to play on words with my name. Yeah.
Great name.
And I love puns. I've been climbing for about 20 years now in all the different disciplines, except for maybe bouldering outside. That's like the final discipline for me. But that's kind of me in a nutshell now. It certainly took me a long time to get to where I am now.
Do you mind kind of going back into that a little bit and talking about your childhood and your family a little bit and kind of like the key moments that led you towards the path that you're on right now?
Yeah, certainly. It's kind of been a sinuous path of my climbing over the years. I found it as a teenager. I grew up in the Northeast in the forest of Maine on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by like deer and black flies. And I had no idea about outdoor sports. I think in like middle school or grade school, I tried out for the soccer team and went to like one practice, and I was like, not for me. And so like that was kind of it for like organized sports.
So what, real quick, what about it that turned you off? Was it the team aspect on it and having to like organize and base your success on other people, or was it just the sport in general in a physicality sense?
That's a good question. I don't really know. That's probably a better question for my parents at this point. But yeah, I just really liked my own personal pursuits, and I liked having a blank canvas, if you will. Like, I didn't like all the rules. I didn't like having to play by anybody else's rules, and I just kind of like doing my own thing. And then I found climbing as a teenager, and like I said, my formative experiences were in the woods, with like 100% humidity and like black flies and like a secondhand rack. And I had no idea what I was doing, and I had like no business being there. And it's kind of honestly amazing that I got away with how much that I did in retrospect. And I'm just like, there isn't a day that it goes by that I'm not thankful for that. And I can really only attribute that to sheer dumb luck, honestly.
I think that's such a common, there's such a common story there to a lot of things of one, like finding your own path, not liking the rules, and climbing so principle oriented, right? Where it's like, you can do something one of 10 ways. You find out what's best for you and what's going to be best in certain circumstances, right? So it kind of fits those individuals. And then the other one is the commonality of just those horror stories of, like people just going out and doing things. I know I've had my experiences that I don't think are like over the top compared to some I've heard. But it's a really common thread, and obviously part of what we're going to be talking about here today. And I think what we're trying to do on this podcast is like how to avoid, like how can we skip that path? How can we have a better linear path getting people into the sport in a safer and a more fundamental way that's just not involving having to pull up your bootstraps and just like, risk some terrible harm to yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've given that much thought in my professional life. Anecdotally, like in hindsight, some of the things that I did, I would go out there by myself and like top rope solo on a single tib lock without a backup, and stuff like that. And I'm like, man, I can't believe that worked for as long as it did. I initially like started tethering myself on multi-pitch climbs with an adjustable daisy chain because I was like, oh, it's adjustable. This is sweet. I did that for like a whole season, and then I realized that like it was only for like body weight, like it was only rated to like 300 pounds. Like, well, it's a really good thing I didn't slip because that thing would have like broken. Yeah, and stuff like that, and yeah, I can really only attribute it to dumb luck, honestly. So
I was reading an article that you wrote, and you have a quote here. It says, "It's rare that we get specific feedback about having made the right or wrong decision." And I think that is so accurate. And I think that for me personally, I feel this specifically on each placement that you make. You only really know if it was good if you fall on it and it holds you. And I think that like this, in the first year of trad climbing that you're talking about and getting into it, there are so many situations like that where you don't know if it was luck, you don't know if it was actually being prepared. And I think that like, as we progress as climbers and get into these, into our career, it's about expanding our knowledge that we know when it's not luck and we know when it's actually being prepared and being aware of the risks that we're trying to mitigate.
Yeah, for sure. And after that statement, I usually say, if given the opportunity to have luck and skill, I'll take both.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really hard to walk down that path and not necessarily get the feedback that we should. And as you both know, climbing is inherently dangerous, right? And I think it always will be. There are certainly advancements in the sport, but it is always going to be a dangerous pursuit, which kind of has this interplay of that's why we're drawn to it in the first place to some degree, right?
Mm-hmm.
To like test our mettle against the mountains and, this idea of just discovering ourselves in the mountains and seeing the world. But yeah, there's just always going to be this aspect of risk and hazard, and how do we learn in a safe environment and still get the information and the experience that we need to. And there's many different paths that folks can take. Like, I don't think it's one prescribed trajectory. We all come from this from different backgrounds and with different goals in mind. And so there's just different ways to do it. But I think being diligent is certainly important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think like you're saying, climbing does take on an inherent level of risk, but you don't need to add more risk to the equation than there already is. And that's the caveat, right? It's like, I know for my accident was completely preventable, 100% preventable, and mistakes happen. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life dwelling on it and beating myself up. Lord knows I've done enough of it. But yeah, the whole point is to mitigate risk, right? And to get out there in the safest way possible. And, hopefully you can take us through a little bit of that today. Yeah.
Yeah. You said something really interesting and something that I've really noticed. I think that risk is really built into the sport. It is intertwined with the experience. And I'm curious as to your view on why that is, and if how much it is required to have that same experience as a climber. Like, if risk wasn't really a part of it, would you feel that climbing would have the same punch to you?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's several kind of components to that. There are certainly folks who try and isolate the movement and isolate the risk and eliminate the risk just for like the sheer pleasure of like the physical movement. And I think of that as like hard bouldering that isn't like high balls, and there's no ropes, there's nothing. It's like really just trying to isolate the most difficult move you can do. I mean, of course, I know folks who have fallen from bouldering and totally messed themselves up, but so it's not completely eliminating it. But yeah, I think the different venues of climbing offer obviously different types of risk and different amounts of risk. But to go back and look at why that is, you kind of need to be a little bit of a historian. And I'm not a climbing historian. I've been doing it for a while. So if any of your listeners um, know more about the history of climbing, please feel free to correct me. But yeah, I mean, the sport was born in 50s, 60s, 70s, in Yosemite and other places where they literally made it up as they went along, right? Like that's where the tradition of the sport kind of was born, right? It was like Yvon Chouinard like forging pitons in the back of his truck or whatever, right? Climbing on hemp ropes. And there were euphemisms in the 60s, mind you, where it was like, back when the sex was safe and the climbing was dangerous, right? And so, that's kind of where the culture of our sport came from. And now you fast forward to, the 2020s, like climbing is in the Olympics, which is amazing. It's awesome. It's really cool to see. But now we just have so many more people coming into the sport with a different background than those folks who were like the vulgarians who like did a bunch of drugs and spent like weeks on a big wall pounding pitons into a granite dome. And so there are remnants of that history in our climbing now. And I think one of the pitfalls of that history is a distinct lack of mentorship and progression and all of those ways that people can sort of, I don't want to say safely, but more responsibly attain larger and larger goals, right? There's this sense of, Wild West where folks are just like, I'm going to go out and I'll figure it out for myself, right? Because that's what everyone who came before me did.
That's what I did.
And yeah, I mean, that's what I did too, more or less until I found instruction. And, but for years, yeah. And so, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's just the way our sport is portrayed. And that's kind of how we get drawn into it. It pulls like these free spirits into it. And, yeah. And so what happens is you've got folks who like just walk into REI and they buy a rope and a rack. And they're like, well, let me see how this works. If they're lucky, they buy a book and watch some YouTube videos. And a parallel that I like to draw is scuba diving, right? So scuba diving is quite dangerous. I'm not a diver myself, but I know several folks who do it professionally, and it's quite dangerous. And there's, a very regimented way to learn how to do it. You can't walk into a scuba shop buy flippers, a regulator, and an oxygen tank and be like, yeah, I'm going to go diving. Right? There's just a really different culture between those two pursuits. And I just find that really interesting. How in climbing, there is just this, free spirit. Now, if you look at the history of diving, right, it was like a military thing through the Navy. And so now it's very regimented because that's kind of where it was born from versus this like counterculture climbing mentality. And so that's kind of what we're fighting now as the sport goes through all these growing pains. And at least that's the way I see it. So
yeah, I think that's a really interesting point, and I really like the analogy to diving. And back to that kind of like hubris and that culture of just trying it out. I think you could pull another analogy, like even one I'm thinking is like physics. Like you can use YouTube and teach yourself physics, and that might work for like particular individuals with certain temperaments, and they might be pretty good at that. I'm sure Elon Musk could teach himself physics online, not that he needs to, but could have at a young age, right? But like the thing is, like obviously our podcast, it's in the name, the majority. We're talking about the majority of people here, right? And for the majority of people, you're just rolling the dice with an experiment there, and there is a lot of risk, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong, right? And so, yeah, I think that's a really great analogy, and it is funny, if I was working at a dive shop and someone just came in and posed that question, it'd be like, and I actually do work. I work at MEC. I don't know if you heard it. So it's in Canada, Mountain Equipment Co-op, right? It's like virtually the REI of Canada. Yeah. And I've had a lot of people who come in, and you just get these unbelievable questions. Whether it's like, I'm gonna self rig this system to like clean my house and to do this or do my sailboat, or I want to get climbing, and you're just like listening to these questions, and like the conversations go polite and you try and educate them, but it is quite bizarre to have somebody who just has done like no due diligence or research or anything like that. And there really is this cultural aspect of climbing of like, I'm just going to figure it out on my own. And it's like, well, do you need to do that anymore is the real question.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. I worked outdoor retail for a number of years as I was trying to break into the guiding industry, and had so many of those conversations myself. Anecdotally, I mean, I've even been that person. So when I was a teenager, my very first rope that my dad bought for me, I took it out, and for whatever reason, that same summer, I had to reshingle a roof on a cabin, and I was like, I don't need any scaffolding. I have a rope, and so like I reshingled this entire roof, just like dangling on the end of my rope, like cantilevered, like anchored over the other side. And it totally worked, but I got black tar all over this brand new rope and like totally ruined this like brand new rope that I was so excited to use, like reshingling a roof, and that just experience has stuck with me. And I was like, it is what it is, but like that happens kind of all the time with folks trying to just rig something up for whatever reason. So yeah. Had plenty of those.
I'm super interested in hearing your perspective on kind of these paths that people have and the options. But before I jump into that, got one more thing about risk that I want to ask you. Risk is built into the sport, because of what we talked about. I think that risk also plays another role. And I think that Dean Potter really is the prime example of what I'm about to talk about. And that's using the exposure to risk to channel focus and to channel performance. For me personally, I recently got into an accident just like Max, and I've been out for 8 months, and I recently just got back on my first trad multi-pitch. And being back on the sharp end and being above gear, I was mitigating risk way crazier than I used to. I was, taking every step I needed to do to make sure that I was being safe, and I was placing gear way more than normal. But still, like, being at the edge, being close to this moment of am I going to fall or am I not? Like it brings up this channel, this flow state, if you will. And I really think that without the risk, I think that, climbers probably wouldn't find such a deep channel of flow state or meditation. And it really draws a certain type of person into the sport. Do you have an experience with this kind of like exposure to risk and the flow state that comes with that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what you're saying. I've certainly done a handful of without a rope, in the mountains, on rock, on ice. And I enjoy it. I really enjoy the freedom of climbing without a rope. I enjoy climbing routes that are hard to protect, and challenging for me, because I do find that flow state to be, I don't want to say addictive, but to some degree, yeah, a little bit, right?
Yeah,
And
totally.
and it's a super fine line between okay and not okay. And I think that's different for everybody, of course. Um, for me personally, I like to stack the deck in my favor as much as I can. Researching a route, I rarely will on-site solo something, unless it's well below my comfortable grade. And but yeah, I don't think the sport would be what it is without that X factor, that risk. Um, and and I often say people go into the mountains to discover the world, but really they just end up discovering their own internal landscape. And I think that kind of captures the essence of what you're talking about, right? It's like we go into the mountains to see the world, but we really just end up figuring out what we're made of, for better or worse. And yeah, I mean, I don't know what else I can say about that relationship to risk. It's definitely something that I think folks should talk more about and be more deliberate with their decisions. I see a lot of folks in many different settings kind of laissez-faire about it, and I really feel like that does the sport a disservice, as a whole, like the community. But yeah, I mean, I think engaging with that risk is just part of it, and like nobody should ever be judged for their decision to face risk, right? Um, I mean, like Alex Honnold, let's take like the craziest example that we have yet to date and may ever have, right? Of him free soloing El Cap, right? That's like a gold medal Olympic performance for however long it took. It was like 4 hours or something, and like if he came in silver, he would have died, right? Like it had to be like gold medal world record performance for like longer than it takes people to run like 2 marathons, to put it in, like, and that's just putting one foot in front of the other, right? And he's like climbing 513, like thousands of feet off the ground. And so, like everybody heralds that as like this amazing achievement, of which it is. And I'm not saying that the risk he incurred was unnecessary. That was a personal decision for him to make, right? But like sometimes it's the outcome that kind of dictates how we look at a thing, right? And so, when the outcome isn't that quote unquote success, we're more critical of it. But I don't really feel like that's fair, you know? Um, because if that risk wasn't there, we wouldn't be there either in a way. Um, and so often it's like Monday morning quarterback or whatever with decisions, and we can kind of get into that decision fatigue.
I think just an interesting point here, real quick, on the free solo topic was that, I think the unsung hero of free solo, I mean, is actually the fact that he spent 2 years fully working out the wall nonstop. And for people who don't understand how much work that is to get up and haul lines and to go down and to work those things in that kind of environment, like he spent 2 years trying to mitigate as much risk as humanly possible. And obviously the achievement and everything about it is the most, it's completely absurd to my reality, because, I can't climb anywhere near any of that for my life. But that's something that I think is really overlooked, right? We like to look at the polished product at the end, and we don't see like whatever that like stone wheel that polished the stone going over for like a year, And so, I just think that's an interesting comment to have on that, right? So,
yeah, I think that's a really excellent point. With social media and just like this instant gratification of just like amazing photos and crazy accomplishments of everyone around the world, and there's just this pressure that we put on ourselves all the time to like climb harder, to like do more, to be radder. And you're like, what does that even mean? Like, I think it was Alex Lowe who said like the best climber is the one having the most fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's worth going back to that. It's like whatever your El Cap is, and I kind of hate to use that analogy, but like that's fine, and yeah. And we just see these finished products all the time plastered everywhere. And, even as a professional in the industry, like I feel it all the time. I'm like, God, I don't climb hard enough. Like, and it's just like, it's not good. It doesn't make me feel good. It doesn't make me want to do the sport, personally. And like, and it just doesn't need to be part of it, but it is.
I know I personally got caught into chasing grades and wrapping that up into my ego and my person, my how I rated myself as a climber. And someone who we interviewed recently named James Pym put it really, really accurately. And he said that the grade that I climb is a culmination of efforts that I've put into my climbing up to this point. It is a result of where I am now, not something that I'm striving for. I'm not chasing the grade. The grade just comes about by my efforts and my love and my passion for climbing. And I thought that was a really, really beautiful way to put it. I think that we can get so focused on what grade do you climb and like, okay, I need to go try this grade because it's the next grade for me. And I think that if we changed our perspective and like tried to have more fun, tried to focus more on safety and climbing for longer amounts of time, I think that the grades just end up coming with that kind of experience rather than it just being the focus point of your entire effort.
Yeah, that is really, really well said, for sure. And I think we're also quick to dismiss how much effort goes into those achievements.
Yes,
absolutely. And we're really quick to say, oh yeah, I can do that, right? Or like, I would like to have already done that, right? And you're like, okay, well, what does it take to actually accomplish that for me, rather than comparing ourselves to everyone else?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. That's, obviously, like you said, social media is essentially a plague in this kind of, thought process and aspect, and just comparing yourself to the achievements of others. I had this kind of epiphany. Epiphany sounds maybe too sophisticated for it, but it was like I was imagining myself trying to climb like Silence, like that 515D route by AMGA, and I was like, if I tried to climb that, it would not be a 515. Do you know what I mean? Like the objective grade might be that for him, but for me, that might as well be like 527. You know what I mean? It's like, it's just not even possible. Like I am my own self, my own individual. That is not the path I'm on. I'm never going to be that. I just know that. And so to like, and not that I compare myself to AMGA, that's like, laughable, but, to compare yourself to these people at the extreme ends, like 2-3 standard deviation from the normal, you're just sitting there going like, okay, like this is just a complete pathway to dissatisfaction consistently in your life and just not ever feeling satisfied. And I would divert back to, your comment on Alex Lowe. It's like, go out there, have fun, go enjoy the sport, and if you really want to work on bettering yourself, do that for yourself and not comparing yourself to others. And what more could you ask or try and get out of it?
Yeah.
I think it's hard though, because when you start climbing, there's like this time where you rapidly get to a certain level because you have the natural ability, you have a certain amount of strength, you have a certain amount of body awareness. And so you see progression really fast. And then you get to this point where you hit this wall. And I think it can get pretty frustrating for people. You're like, well, like, okay, I got to 512 within the first 2 years of climbing. Like, I should be climbing 13s by now. And I think it's important for us to understand just like, when you reach that kind of like equilibrium of kind of your body's ability and in your climbing sense, it's going to take an insane amount of dedication and effort and practice to change where that equilibrium is and where your standards are as a climber. Because the first 2 years of climbing are going to be kind of establishing where that is, and that's not the same as changing like and improving who you are as a climber. Right? There's like definitely a difference.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and that kind of happens individually and collectively with any sport. I mean, if you take any Olympic event and you look at the world record over time, there are like wild jumps, and then those incremental improvements become smaller and smaller over time as we just find the limit of human capacity in any given event. And I think the same happens with climbing. And so what we need to recognize is that it's not a linear scale, right? Like the Yosemite decimal system isn't really linear.
Thank you. Yes, exactly.
And so like that's kind of a huge shift if you're like, because 10A is not like 10A to 11A is not equal to 13A to 14A.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
Those are not linear comparisons. And I don't think enough folks actually understand what that means. And so they have these unrealistic expectations and goals of what they'll be able to accomplish, like racing from 5'5" to 5'10", right? You're like, oh my God, I'm going to be Chris Sharma. And like,
exactly.
Yeah. Like it's not even possible, right? And I think I just read an article actually that Sharma just on-sighted a 14B, and totally wrong about this, but like it may be his first like 14B on-site or something. I don't know. I don't know why it made the news for that, and I may be totally misquoting it, but like the industry has like far surpassed him, right? Like Adam Ondra has on-sighted, like 14Ds and stuff, and so like, yeah, it's just it's not a linear scale, and we have like our human brains can't see nonlinear things easily.
Yeah, for sure. So I think obviously, we've covered talking about kind of risk and dissatisfaction getting into climbing and, kind of how to approach the sport from a more practical sense to leave yourself satisfied. And so on that kind of topic of like mentorship and risk and stuff, let's kind of go through the process. Like, what are the resources here for, the majority of climbers out there? What's a great path for them to take?
Yeah, totally. I mean, the great thing, social media is a blessing and a curse, right? I mean, we kind of talked about the curse of it with just being this perpetual like comparison to other people, but the internet is an amazing place, right? And Ray Jardine and Yvon Chouinard back in Yosemite, like they didn't have YouTube, they didn't have like channels of folks like giving free information out into the ether via like Instagram and YouTube and other websites and all sorts of stuff. And I think there is just a plethora of high quality information out there to be digested. Now, that comes with a caveat in that you don't always know the quality of the information that's being posted. Like, is it reputable? You can't.
Is it even true?
yeah, is it true? Like, is this going to work for me? Right. But there is a bunch of information out there on the ether. There's a bunch of like published books that I think are really excellent over a range of topics. And I think all those resources are really great. Mountain Project has photos of objectives. It's crowdsourced information, so read it with a grain of salt. But I think doing your homework and just digesting all of that information is really important to like being able to go out and have an experience, a positive experience. Of course there's always professional instruction, such as myself or someone else who is a vetted, certified instructor or disseminator of information. I go through like a peer-reviewed process, the same as any academic, right? Like I've been reviewed by my peers to the best of their ability. And, like one of the things that we get evaluated on is our decision making, right? It's not a paint by numbers. It's more of a blank canvas. And, and so a problem with all these resources like the internet, books, is context, right? It's really hard to put all of these little sound bites into context. And, and that's where I encourage folks to go out and make mistakes, but learn from them, right? I kind of jokingly say in a lot of my courses that good decision making comes from experience, and experience comes from making poor decisions, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's the fastest way we learn. That's for sure. As long as we can survive the lessons.
Right. And therein kind of lies the rub. It is this risky, dangerous sport. And so, try and not bite off more than you can chew. Increments is kind of what I tell people. Like, don't try and put everything on yourself all at once. Build your skill set over time, and then like slowly work your way up, like a pyramid, right? You've got a huge foundation, and then it gets smaller and smaller as you go towards the top, and it just creates a stable structure, right? You want to do that with your experiences. Like if the biggest route you've ever climbed was 3 pitches, you're not going to be like, cool, yeah, I'm ready to climb a 16 pitch route that's 2 letter grades harder than the hardest thing I've ever climbed, right? But I don't think everyone sees it that way. And they can certainly climb that route eventually, but maybe not with this like instant gratification that we've come to accept.
I think another example of what you're just talking about is someone who maybe completes their first or second trad lead at a crag, and then immediately, maybe they've climbed a 510 at a crag, and they're like, all right, cool, I can climb 510 trad. They open a guidebook and they see Mount Whitney at 5.8, and they're just like, oh, okay, it's 2 number grades lower than my trad lead. I've got it, and there's like so many other aspects to climbing a route like that in the mountains that needs to be taken into account. And I think it's really easy for people to just like be, once again, myopically focused on the grade and your performance to complete that grade. But there is just so much else that goes into climbing some of these bigger objectives.
Yeah, for sure. Something that I give my students at the end of courses is this kind of 3-pillar approach. And so the climbing movement is just one component, right? It's like in order to do your objective, you have to be able to physically ascend that objective, but that's only one of 3 components. The other two are the technical systems to make it safe to do so, and the mental fortitude. And so I like to say you can isolate and train those three pillars, and then a rising tide will raise all ships, right? And you'll just get better at all three. And then when they come together and you have your like flow state Zen moment in the mountains, it's like a beautiful thing. But you're kind of begging for disaster when you push two or even all three of those categories at the same time. And so it's just a training metric for assessing where you're at and what you can appropriately tackle with a reasonable amount of difficulty. And it's been useful. I mean, I use that for myself when I'm like, yeah, like, can I do this? Like, I've been skiing all season. Like, I don't know if I should do this right now. Wait till the fall. And yeah, and I just think it's a great metric because not a lot of people put that much into it. They just like open up the guidebook and they're like, what's the raddest thing? And then they throw themselves at it. And like sometimes they epic and sometimes, they're successful, and sometimes, they more than epic.
And once again, this goes back to your quote that I read in the beginning, where you throw yourself at something and you're successful, and you don't sit down and do this analyzation of kind of what went down, and you just take it off and check the box as a success, and that you're competent enough to do it again, but you don't really understand what situations you just got lucky in, and what situations you are actually prepared for. And I think back to the risk thing again, too, I think it's really easy to rely on your physical prowess and your ability to climb in that flow state, and just kind of get overly confident in your ability to not fall and to perform the athletic ability, to where you start to not mitigate risk as effectively, and just naturally start to take on more risk than is necessary, because you are getting so confident in that flow state and in that performance that you're starting to find.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's definitely a delicate balance. But I mean, I do that all the time where I'm just like, I'm not going to place gear here. I've done this route 1,000 times. I'm just going to keep going. Um, be it on an easy route for work, or like skipping clips on a steep sport route, and you're just like totally at your limit. And you're like, oh, I'm not going to clip this bolt because that's too hard, but I'm going to keep climbing higher.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We all I mean, like my palms just thinking about it, because I've done it, and like in all likelihood I'm gonna do it again, even though like I shouldn't. Yeah, and like sometimes we're met with success and we get to the chains and we're like, yeah, I'm so strong, I even skipped that clip. Right? Sometimes we fall and hurt ourselves, and we're like, oh man, should have stick that, or like should have like clipped that quick draw or whatever. And yeah, it's definitely a delicate balance in all disciplines, from sport climbing to trad climbing to alpine climbing in the mountains, where time is safety and you do have to run it out, but the terrain is also like crumbly, and you're just like, man, like, doesn't matter how good I am, if I grab a hold and it comes off in my hand, like that's not on my ability. It's just the environment.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really astute observation for sure. And I wish more folks would take the time to like really digest the consequences of that.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point, and I really like the term digest the consequences. And I think something to think of, from your three pillars with technical systems, is with so many moving components and wanting to operate on principle based, we can call it like principle learning, I'd say. You don't know what you don't know. So you could be really, really competent in doing a lot of stuff, but if you've been climbing with the exact same climbing partner the whole time and you've never hired a guide or you've never had another person climb with you or something, you could have some small caveat or some small thing that just, yeah, hey, that's actually really dangerous for X, Y, and Z reasons. And you might not even know that. So I think it's really important to diversify learning, to climb with, different people, to climb with mentors. I know for myself, like I really have had some amazing experiences with hiring guides, and it's one thing to feel pretty like capable and competent, or dare I even say intelligent, and learn something on YouTube and read it in a book. But then when you're there and you're about to like weight a system and trust your life to it, it's way nicer to have had someone who's like very, very competent, and whether that's an industry professional standard or someone who just you've vetted this person in their trust. It's very different to have that person walk that through you in real time. And so I think that's really something to take in consideration for people is don't get complacent. Very easy to get complacent, and there's a lot of moving components to that. And I think with that, obviously, with you yourself, like being an industry professional and stuff, maybe if you could take us through a little bit about like the process, like what's the best reason to get a guide? When should I get a guide? What are deterrents from getting a guide? There's lots of things to go into there. And I think this is a great place to kind of transition.
Yeah, for sure. You actually reminded me of another resource. There is, like clubs, like the American Alpine Club, the Canadian Alpine Club, different states like Colorado, where I live, has a club. And those are really great places to meet like-minded folks, and to find mentors and partners and stuff. And so that was just another resource that I wanted to make sure folks were aware of. As far as like actually getting professional instruction from a mountain guide or a certified guide, I say that I can always take someone to the next level wherever they're at, right? And so, wherever you are at in your career, if you want to go to that next level, a professional can help you achieve that, right? And so what I say by next level, right, is like, I know plenty of folks who climb, they're sport climbers. Like they don't want to trad climb. They don't want to multi-pitch climb. Maybe they'll follow some trad climbs, but they don't want to lead. And they're perfectly competent in their discipline. And that's great, right? And then there's this other group of folks that are always trying to do like the next thing, right? Like the bigger, the harder thing. And so, if you are a gym climber and like you know how to top rope and you know how to lead in the gym and you want to go out into an unmanufactured landscape, like that's a really great junction to do like a gym to crag sort of course that'll talk about all sorts of things, like how to hang the draws for yourself, like how to clean the route, like things that you may encounter outside that you wouldn't in the gym. That's like a really big transition. And so I think those transitions are really important spots for when you can most effectively hire a professional, right? Like if you're trying to go from sport climbing into trad climbing, right? Like that's a really good junction to get some instruction and some mentorship. If you're going from trad climbing in the single pitch environment to multi-pitch trad climbing, right? I think that's also a really great place to just, whenever there's going to be something new, basically, and then like if you're getting into winter climbing and ice climbing, right? If that's maybe your first experience climbing ever, then well, like, that's not for most folks, but um but yeah, like that's a whole different host of hazards, right? And so all of those junctions or transitions, I think, are really great opportunities to learn and put ourselves out there with a professional. Um, and I do understand that it is cost prohibitive for a lot of folks, and I really wrestle with that because I try and I would love to provide my services to underprivileged folks who don't have access to the outdoors and want to do the sport, um and I don't know what the answer is there for the financial barrier into being able to do this, other than those of us with the knowledge volunteering and mentoring our time to those groups that can't necessarily afford our services. But yeah, that's kind of what I would say.
I think that with the financial aspect of it, you bring up a really good point because, personally, I have not hired a guide before just because of the cost. And I think it's really easy for people to try to find the cheapest option, and that be maybe a class at the gym or these climbing festivals that you see, like the Cracking Classics. I've
Mm-hmm.
personally been a photographer at multiple of these events, and I've been a part of these clinics. And while there is some level of basic knowledge that's being passed, it's really basic and really washed down. And each time that I've ever been a part of one of these clinics, even if it's with a respectable guide like yourself, the content is just, to me, just like lacking.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like a lot of people are trying to save a buck and also have fun at the same time, and
Yeah.
just not getting the deep level of understanding that you really need in these times of transition, like you're talking about. And I think that is where the cost difference lies. It's because you're getting a one-on-one session. You're getting private instruction. And I don't care what sport you're in, private instruction is effing expensive. And that's just the way it is. And you just need, I think that it's really important for, us in this podcast, and for guides like yourselves, and for people here in America, especially, just to recognize how important it really is, instead of kind of like always searching for like that cheap instant fix of like, okay, how basic of an understanding can I get so I can go just teach myself, because the risks just are way too high.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll just add to that about the industry that a lot of folks might not be aware of, and you're exactly right. I mean, you kind of get what you pay for in a lot of industries with that, right? And folks are looking for the cheapest option, and they're kind of doing themselves a disservice in the long run. You know, I would say to anyone who's listening, who's thinking about hiring a guide, is go and find an independent guide who's certified, right? Like, don't hire a big guide service, because you never know what you're going to get. Um, it's really hard in the industry because it's not regulated to some degree. Like, another analogy that I use is, in order to cut hair, you need a license to operate, right? In order to be a mountain guide, you do not need any sort of training or license. A guide service just needs to hire you, and you can like take people out into the mountains. Like, that's pretty scary. And so even the guiding industry itself is like fraught with problems. Um, and and so, because guiding and the instruction kind of happens in a vacuum. If you get poor instruction, you don't know it's poor instruction until you have something to compare it to. And if you only go to a climbing festival, or you hire a big guide service, someone who's, like in their early 20s, or like they're a teenager and they like just learned to climb and now they're this mountain guide, trying to show you something that they just learned, right? You're gonna have less retention. It's just going to be a worse experience, and you're not going to learn as much. And so, for anybody listening, I strongly suggest hiring a certified guide, and really vetting that person, and making sure that they're the best for your goals, and to help mentor you. And you owe it to yourself to be an active participant in kind of your own adventure, especially when you're investing that kind of money.
Yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. And a couple things on that. I think one, we're all being brought up in this really consumer basis, society, and we want everything to be as cheap as possible, as long lasting as possible, and absolutely as best as possible, and those are just all really conflicting ideas. And also just to point out, we recently were talking to Cody Bradford and doing an interview with him, and he was kind of going through the process of him getting certified for the AMGA. Like, this is not an easy thing. It's not a weekend course. There's a lot of risk involved with this. Mountain guides take on a lot of inherent risk, and certified good mountain guides are absolutely, stand out professionals in dangerous environments. So, people will go spend 40, 50 bucks to get a restaurant meal and a beer or something. They'll go pay 80, 100 bucks for a physio visit. You're getting a mountain guide for potentially 6 to maybe 10 hours, something like that, like an entire day, So I think if you break down the cost like that, and then you also break it down looking at what you said based off of these transitions, it's not something you have to do every single week, right? But if you are doing it on these transitions, and you look at the cost over time, and then you look at the benefit of that cost, like another analogy to that is like working at this outdoor store, and people who want to cheap out and buy cheap helmets, or they want to keep the helmet they've had for like 10 years. That's completely maybe some of the hard case helmets for climbing are still okay, but like the biking helmets for the foam actually biodegrades over time. You're kind of like sitting there rolling the dice. Like, is this really the thing you want to be stingy on from a financial point of view? And it's kind of nearsighted, right? So, and then also just back to tie into what you were saying there about being an active participant. So, like my approach when I've gone out with guides is like, I've tried to do a whole bunch of research and reading into the area that I'm looking to kind of break into and become more competent in. And then I've, created like a list, like, what am I looking to get out of this individual? Then you reach out, you find the person, and you go out. And so I think that's like active participation, right? And so I think that is a way where you can just get so much out of your experience with that individual. And I'm just wondering if you think there's like any other tips or something you have to be an active participant. What can you do to get the most out of your guiding experience?
Yeah, that's really great. Anecdotally, I just want to go back to your equipment. One thing that I used to say is, climbing gear or any outdoor equipment is either light, durable, or cheap. Like, you get to pick two.
Yeah.
And so, but yeah, I mean, I think that what can you do to get the most out of your experience? Ask for homework, right? Like, before your outing, ask if there's anything that you can do beforehand to help prepare you for the day. I think a big distinction though is I kind of break down what I do into two categories. So there's like objective based guiding, and then there's instruction, right? And so the more you have of one, the less you're inherently going to have of the other. So like if I'm taking someone up a large technical, like multi-pitch rock climb, there's going to be minimal instructing, but there's going to be like coaching and stuff that happens. And it's going to be an experiential education versus like more of a ground school where we're like building anchors on the ground and we're talking about transitions and placing gear and anchors and like talking about all that stuff. The objective is small, but the learning is potentially more. So thinking about where you fall on what you want your day to look like, do you want it to be an experience, or do you want it to be educational? Do you want it to be a combination of the two? I think those are two really big distinctions that people don't always make. I often have folks come to me and they're like, I want to climb like a really big route and I want to cover these topics. And I'm like, okay, well, that's like, it kind of sounds like 2 different days to me. If you want it to be like worthwhile. So just like forethought going into it in terms of those 2 distinctions. And then if you are going the educational component, I will often send folks links to YouTube videos, websites, books, and articles and things to read before our day to just kind of prime them for thinking about stuff. And then that way they're, learning as much as they can on their own. And then it allows us to just kind of go to the next level once we're actually there in person, and it's not me showing it to them for the first time. And then another metric that I like to use is everyone kind of has a different ratio to personal days to guided days. And, I all the time, I'm encouraging folks to like go out and climb on their own. And so what I mean by that is like 10 days, 15 days, 100 days, like a whole season of you doing something on your own and learning and progressing, and then coming back and kind of like getting evaluated and checked out, and then like maybe some new tricks introduced once you've got that solid foundation. And so everybody kind of has a different number. I certainly climb with folks who only want to climb with me, and they don't have the time or the energy to go out on their own, and they just want someone to put their rope up. And like, that's great. And I love doing that. I also love the teaching component of it. And, if you go out for a season or 2, and then you come back to a guide and you're like, hey, like, these are the things I've accomplished. These are where my goals lie. Like, how do I go from here to here? And they, if they're worth their mettle, they'll be able to give you a pretty good trajectory to help you kind of realize your goals.
I guess on that topic, since we're kind of going through this and what it's like to be like an active participant, I'm just wondering, like, if you would kind of divulge maybe like a little bit from your perspective, like, how do you prepare for a day out with clients, whether that's, your kind of more instructional days of the crag or your larger objective days, like from the guide's perspective, what is a day like that? What does the preparation into that look like for you?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, aside from just maintaining my own physical fitness so that I can accomplish the objective, do what is asked of me, it usually almost always starts with a phone call. I don't book a single day without having a conversation with someone to just make sure that what they're signing up for is exactly what best suits them.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, I call it expectation management. Just making sure that we're on the same page, right? And making sure that they're going to get out of it what they want and feel like they had a successful, valuable experience. So if it's a big objective, in the mountains, I'll ask folks to submit like a resume that will, beyond reasonable doubt, convince me that they are capable of joining me on this objective. And that's if I've never worked with this person before. Oftentimes I'll have worked with folks for years and mentor them. And so I know intimately kind of where they're at, and I'll pick objectives that are, increasing in difficulty and challenge so that they can be met with challenge that isn't insurmountable at like every step, and then ultimately like feel successful because they were able to accomplish something that they weren't sure they were able to. But if I've never climbed with someone before, I'll ask for just a resume to convince me that that's an objective that's appropriate for them. Because oftentimes, I wouldn't say folks lie, but oftentimes folks will overestimate their ability. One of the classic routes here is this route called the casual route on the diamond of Long's Peak. And, it's 510A, so it seems very, very attainable. And, often I'll get folks who are like, yeah, I like climb 510 in the gym. I can do that, right? And I'm just like, well, there's a lot more that goes into it. We should maybe start on some lower grades that are shorter climbs and work on our efficiency and work on, climbing with a pack, right? Eating and on a climb, and all those things. So I really am quite conservative with the like objectives that I take people out, having not met them before. And then for the instruction, there's very little risk there. So I'm not so much like mitigating that by just choosing where to go. I'm more just looking for a venue that's going to lend itself to teach the skills that the person wants to learn. And I always bring more stuff than necessary because, I'm usually not leaving the ground, or if I am, it's just for a pitch or two. And with the instruction, I'm always flexible because often we end up working on stuff that wasn't necessarily what they wanted, but they didn't know they needed. And so we got to build that foundation before we can get to where they want to go. But yeah, those are kind of the preparatory things that I do.
I'm going to pitch you a situation right here. I want to see if this is something that's in the realm of, of what you've experienced before. Let's say I hire you as a guide, and my pitch is, hey, I've got this objective. I want you to follow me up this multi-pitch and critique my performance on placements, movement, anchor building, positioning, A to Z. Is that kind of a guide to client relationship that you've experienced before?
Yeah, absolutely. I do that often. It's some of the most rewarding work that I get to do, because it's helping folks in the hot seat and helping folks like realize their dreams. And, that's as being as much of an active participant in your own adventure as you can be. Right. And so, I work with a lot of folks who are leading and just want feedback. That's definitely something that I do. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the most risky or dangerous work that I do, but it's definitely the trickiest because I'm leading from the back, if you will, right? So it's like I'm being even more conservative about setting them up for success, so that they can have a good experience and a good learning outcome in that situation. And then I can give them valuable feedback. So, it's like I like to see folks on-siting so I can see their on-site decision making. Generally, I keep it well within their climbing ability, their climbing like grade. Because that's not really what we're focusing on for the day. If somebody wants to push their their movement ability, I can do that too, but I would often do it like at a sport crag, right? But for multi-pitch trad, yeah, I love that. Like when folks put the rope up for me, it's great. I have so much fun, and and I'll like get up there and be like, oh yeah, this is a sweet anchor. This totally works. But like, did you see this over here? Like your master point would have been a little bit higher, and then like your low back wouldn't hurt from like leaning over so much. Or like, how about if you like slung this horn and like equalized it to this stopper and like put a cam in, or whatever the case may be, and just like having folks who have that level of understanding, and then just taking them to that next level so that they can do it on their own
I think that is like for me personally, that's where I would be. And I think it's really easy for, people like myself who've had 6 years plus experience trad climbing and have done mountain objectives to just be like, I've been successful up to this point. I clearly know what I'm doing. And I think that's just, it's the ego talking, and it's a false sense of security. And I think that, just because you've succeeded, X amount of years or X amount of objectives doesn't really mean you can say you know what you're doing. And I think that, it's really, really important to get a third person's perspective, and like a situation like that, hiring a guide for me would just be like legendary. And I think that, I highly encourage people that kind of are in my shoes and my experience level to do that, and to set your ego aside and to really kind of like open up yourself in terms of what you can learn more.
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing I would say is to kind of put aside that language of like, oh, I know what I'm doing, or I don't know what I'm doing, right? It's like, you don't need to not know what you're doing in order to take it to the next level with an instructor, right? So like, you don't need to offend your ego and like kind of put up that wall and be like, I'm good, I know what I'm doing, right? You're just taking it to the next level, right? It's like, you do know what you know, and don't discount that. Like, you are competent, you are confident, like you do know how to do the thing. You're just learning how to do more. And like, I think that's a way better mindset and approach, because it allows you to take it to that next level while also validating all of your previous experience.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering, Max, like what do you do from like a risk analysis standpoint with a client? Like, what are different considerations that you have? And also, how do you approach a day, maybe for a larger objective or a new objective or something? Is there a list you like to go through? Is there a conversation you have? Do you debrief? Like, what are the tools in your box essentially that help you succeed in that kind of an environment?
You mean like the skills that I kind of need them to possess in order to be like part of a team, or for like me to be able to go up there?
Like your approach, like if you were going to take a client out and you were going to do this route on Longs Peak, the 10A variation, what are the kind of risks and considerations that you yourself look into if you maybe haven't done the route, or maybe you've done it once? Just maybe like to look at kind of a linear approach of like, if someone wanted to emulate, what you do to prepare for an objective, like a listener here who's thinking of doing an objective, and they're like, how is this guy getting ready for this?
Yeah, totally. I think one of the biggest things that I do is just my homework of like knowing what I'm going to encounter. I know what each pitch looks like. I know the climbing style that it's going to be. I know more or less how it's going to be protected. If I'm up in the mountains and I'm like getting surprised, that's just mentally exhausting. And then that takes away from everything else that we're able to do. So do yourself a favor and like do your homework beforehand. Stand on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, there is something to be said of just like the aesthetic of like looking at a mountain and like just walking into the hills and like throwing your way up the mountain, and just like, but that's not really what we're doing here. And so do your homework. Another thing is know how you could bail from anywhere on the route. That's really important. And there's actually a really great book that just came out by Andy Kirkpatrick called Down. And I think everybody should read it. It's a really great book. It's just like all things descent. Um, and so, oftentimes the length of rope that I bring is dictated more by the descent than the ascent. And so there are many routes that, yeah, I could bring a single 60-meter rope if all is well, and then I just walk off the top, right? But if anything were to happen halfway, man, a single 60 isn't going to quite cut it to get back down, right? So using double ropes, bringing a Beal escaper.
I was about to ask you about that, like what your opinion on the escaper
I
is.
think it's awesome,
Yeah, me too.
I think it's really great. I don't necessarily use it as like a plan A for a lot of situations, but I think it's certainly a viable, like, what does it cost, right? Like a few ounces, if even, in the bottom of your pack.
Yeah,
I'm actually unfamiliar with this particular technique, the Beal escaper. I've never even heard of it. Can you kind of dive into this at all?
So the Beal escaper is kind of like, it's like almost like an accordion weave of Dyneema, and then it has like a rope tail that goes through, and the tail goes through the accordion, and it loads and sets itself with friction. There, he's grabbing one. And so essentially you can wrap on a single rope attached to this, and when you get to the bottom, you crank the rope really, really hard, and eventually through tension and release, the actual component slowly slips through.
Yeah. So it works on a component of something that, like, we have always been taught never to do: tie friction hitch with Dyneema and trust our lives to a single friction hitch.
Yeah.
So you tie the rope into the bottom, and then you kind of have like the tail bit going through the Dyneema friction hitch, and there's like a little bungee, and you kind of just pull on it, and it'll eventually cinch down, and then the whole thing will release and come down.
Okay.
And if it doesn't like give you butterflies in your stomach, like the first time you see it, you're not paying attention.
Yeah, there's something wrong with you. Funny enough, actually, the first time I used one of those, I was on a day out with this guy, Sebastian Toborski, really, really great guy, and we climbed the weeping wall, and we were doing the wrap on the right side, which is just this like cataclysmic overhanging cliff into the abyss, and this guy's just setting up the Beal escaper, and then he's going first, and he's like, yeah, just make sure you take off the backup before you go, and like we're having this little laugh about it. It's quite funny, but yeah, I remember just being like, man, this is just like out of the world, so like lo and behold, it was very safe, and for anybody listening to it, if you actually familiarize yourself with the product and you use it, you'll realize that it actually makes a lot more sense, and it's quite safe. Like, it's not like, oh, I just bounced twice on it and the rope comes off, like depending if you're pulling really straight to a bolted anchor or something, it will release, within reason. But like, I've had times where you have to like pull on the rope like 40 times, like super hard, cranking it. So it's not like it's just going to like undo itself while you're rappelling. But obviously it is a really great product, whether you're running that through like V threads to wrap or just taking a single rope and not having to have the weight of that double rope, right? So it's a really unique product.
Yeah. I mean, doing the weeping wall wraps with an escaper is super committing, because there's no other route there. Yeah. Anecdotally, the first time I ever used it was with my partner, with my girlfriend, and she cried. She was like, I don't want to use this. I'm so sorry, but we're going to use this. And she's like, never make me do that again. And I was like, that is deal, fair.
What's your thoughts on the phrase, the point of no return?
I think that's a really interesting concept. I like to think of it or frame it a little bit differently in like failing upwards, right? Like you can still epic, but like sometimes on every route of any size, there becomes a point where going to the top is easier than going back the way you came.
Mm-hmm.
And I think knowing where that point is and just how complicated each option is really important.
Before you start or mid-route?
I mean, I think just reassessing all the way through, right? You can't always retreat, right? I mean, like there are certainly some routes where you're like, I just can't, like, we just can't go back down. There's like a huge traverse or something, some impasse, and I think that that's a point where like you and your partner need to kind of just be like, okay, are we good? Like, should we continue? Like, even if it's just a pause and a look, right? Which is like some acknowledgement of the commitment that
reaching that point.
Yeah, that you're about to undertake.
I think of two examples. The first one is just a personal example. Is my buddy and I climbed Dark Star in the Eastern Sierra on Temple Crag, and yeah, I mean there definitely was a point of up, not down. At that point with how wandery and traversy that route is, and just how huge it is, we definitely felt the severity of that kind of feeling. But then at the same time, I also think of Jim Danini on his ascent in the Karakoram, where he did, what was it, 84 single nut rappels. And we say that there's no point of return for a climb like that, and then you've got Jim Danini doing 3 days of 84 rappels on a single nut. So it's like you said, it's really just kind of understanding, in his situation there was no way but doing 84 rappels. That was the only way to survive the entire encounter in the first place. But I guess I don't know exactly what I'm trying to drive home here. It's just like, it's really just trying to understand what the safest option is, whether it is up or down, given the situation that you're finding yourself in.
I think there was a great caveat to that, which is, what Max was saying before, which is, if you have studied the route really, really well, and you have looked at it and analyzed it from a point of like getting down, you might be able to make that decision for yourself, right? You might be able to be like, okay, well, we know that if we do X, like we're thinking about going up, and we know that this is going to be the point where things are going to get really, really complicated to get down, right? And so you might want to just err on the side of caution if you've done your homework, or if you haven't done your homework, you might be in for a really great adventure, or you might be in for a really, really bad day. And I think that's the importance of
I mean,
being conservative
if you're
and doing your homework.
If you're doing like a big route in the mountains or on a big wall where large distances are being covered, you can always just like throw an extra rack of stoppers in the bottom of the pack, right? Like it's quite impressive that Jim had 84 stoppers.
I know,
right? That's kind of this part of that story that catches me. It's like, what was he doing with that many stoppers in the first place? Right. And so, we as climbers are like frugal and we don't want to leave gear. And like when we come across like fixed gear, we're like, oh, just give me a sec. Like my entire purpose in life is to remove this number 3 cam, that was here like 4 seconds ago. And while I think that's great, it's also like, well, what is our life worth? Right. Like put gear in, build good, comfortable anchors for rappelling. Like if you do have to bail and leave your entire rack, like who cares? Mm-hmm. Like that's what it's there for, right?
And like, have you heard of Smiley Project?
I have, yeah.
Totally. Have you seen his thing that he promotes? He's like, if you bail, take a picture of the anchor, take a picture of the gear you left, tell me your story, and I'll buy your gear. That's literally what he says. And that's so amazing.
I was just about to say that I think that is awesome and super admirable that he does that. And like, you know, and he also turns it into an educational thing. He's like, yeah, we're going to talk about it and I'm going to make you it's going to be a good learning experience. And I think that I wish there was more of that culture in climbing. And I think that really positive reinforcement or way to just go about what happens. You know, I mean, like I've left stuff in the mountains. I've bailed off of routes. You know, it happens, right? And you leave the gear that you need to leave in order to do it safely and come back another day or not come back.
Yeah, I think that's actually an interesting thing about talking about like the culture though of like bailing or other things and back to like failing and climbing is like, you know, the majority of climbing really is failing. There's no soccer game where you're like, I didn't get to the end of the game. You know what I mean? Whereas like, that's like a really common like happenstance in climbing is like, you didn't send your climb, you didn't finish your thing or whatever. And I think social media has definitely just got to be compounding that of we're just, got to get to the top, man. Got to get to the top. Got to do it. Right. And it's like, that's, I think historically very inaccurate for what climbing is climbing is really, you are the sum of your greatest failures, not necessarily failures as in like, you know, me breaking my ankles, but like the things you didn't accomplish that you learned from, those are what have like built you up into, you know, the individual you are and how capable you are in the mountains. And it's so easy to lose sight of that.
Yeah, certainly. There's definitely a lot of that. I mean, back to like the Alex Honnold example of the years that he spent rehearsing that, right? It's like he spent, you know, 2 years not doing it, right? And he even attempted it once and came down, right? And so, yeah, if you don't enjoy the process, then I think you just kind of need to look inward as to like, why are you doing this? Like, right? Like, what is your goal? Like, why are you engaging in this activity? You know, one conversation that I have with folks who are looking to go on longer expeditions like Denali, right? It's like a 3-week trip on a glacier. And if you're lucky, you get to spend 15 minutes at the top, right? And so it's like, if your entire goal for that 3 weeks is to have already done that 15-minute period, then you're kind of there for the wrong reasons. Like, you gotta love the process, you know? You've gotta love falling. Like, you've gotta love like trying hard, finding your limit and being like, okay, you know, well, that didn't work. Maybe I'll try a heel hook next time. Or maybe, you know, I'll hangboard and like, you know, I need to train this or that or whatever to accomplish the goal. But it's really the process that I think is super fun, and just like seeing what our bodies are capable of. And you know, and of course, like, people climb for so many different reasons, and it isn't always about the physicality of it. You know, for a lot of folks it is, but you know, I also know tons of folks who climb 5'7", 5'8", super comfortably. They could climb way harder, but they're just like, I don't want to deal with it. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. And I think we kind of just get in our heads, you know, with social media and with all this stuff of like, it doesn't matter unless it's like hard. You're like, well, but hard is hard. Like, sometimes I just want to have fun.
Hard is also dangerous.
Hard can also be very dangerous. Totally. Yeah.
Especially in trad. I think it's like, you know, let's say you can on-site 10C trad and you're like, all right, cool, I'm ready to get into the 11s. Like, maybe you can climb an 11 trad on top rope, but you have to place gear. You need to be able to clip. You need to be able to still calmly and effectively place gear.
Yeah.
and trust the gear that you're on. And that's kind of the situation I found myself in, is like I had more competency in my physicality than I did in my ability to trust my own gear, and I paid constant consequences of that. And moving forward in my climbing career, it's definitely more just going to be about safety and about enjoyment. Finding cool lines instead of like climbing this obscure 11 minus that doesn't even have any stars on Mountain Project. I'm going to go search for the 5-star 5.9 and like have 4 pitches of epicness instead of, just being obsessed with how hard I can climb.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I think there's, and of course I'm generalizing here, but I think there's like 2 kind of categories of people. There's like the folks who come out of the gym and like they might be insanely strong. Like they might be like 12 plus 13 climbers on sport. And then they're like, oh, whatever, 512 minus, like, yeah. And they start climbing trad at like a crazy high level. And I think in one way that's kind of a recipe for disaster. And then there's also the person who doesn't climb sport so much, and they're like, okay, yeah, my limits are at whatever grade. I'm trying to push that. And, all they do is trad climbing. Right. And so they're not training that pillar of that physical movement much higher than where their technical skill is. And so, personally, some of the hardest trad leads I've ever done have been when I'm sport climbing really well. And I think that is overlooked by a lot of folks. They're like just excited for one medium or the other, and they don't necessarily realize or just have that training paradigm to be like, oh, like if I want to climb like this hard trad route, I should maybe like go and like regularly, comfortably on site that grade at a sport crag first, or concurrently. And I think that's just another way of being prepared.
Yeah, I think the something I've always heard, and I kind of have, especially now, I've kind of held to myself, is the safest form of climbing is not falling, especially in trad. Um, and I think that just rings true, like with what you just said, like climbing really hard trad routes. Like it's important for you to be able to try to climb that without falling that much, just for your own safety. And in general, it's just safer when you can climb trad without falling all the time. And I think it's important to they say if you can climb 512 sport, then you should be climbing low 511 trad. Like there's this disparity between what you can climb in a safer, more controlled environment versus what you can climb when there's a lot more risk involved.
Yeah, there's also the style component, right? It's like most sport climbs are like crimps and dynamic gymnastic movements, right? And like you could be a 512 rock climber and like sport climber and have never put your hand in a crack, right? And then you get on a 511 crack and you're just like, what is this? Right? You're like trying to open the elevator.
To gas on, yeah.
Yeah. You're just like, what is going on, right? And so again, it's like play to your strengths and train your weaknesses. Right. So it's like whenever you're trying to do a new thing or like a new grade or whatever, like play to your strengths. And then when you're out training, train your weaknesses. And I think that's a really great way to become like a well-rounded rock climber and alpinist. But yeah, and it's different for everybody, the whole like rules of thumb, like, oh, if you're doing this at this grade, you should be doing that at that grade. Like, yeah, it's a great benchmark, but it doesn't always hold true. And like, you can't ever tie up your own like self-worth with those like rules of thumb. Like, I think that's just kind of a recipe for disaster in terms of our own internal dialogue. Actually, just on that last point, I just want to add just the nature of a lot of terrain. Climbers will start on 5.5, 5.6, 5.7, 5.8, and those routes tend to be ledgier, right? And then you get into like 5.11, 5.12, they're steeper and they're cleaner falls. And and so it's kind of counterintuitive, right? But it's like on the easy 5.7 terrain where you're like, I'm just running it out, like I'm just doing the thing, right? And you like surmount like 5 or 6 ledges before placing another piece, and you're just like, and you look down and you're like, man, right? Versus like a clean overhanging finger crack, right? Or something that's like just gently overhanging or slightly less than vertical, but there's like less to hit. I mean, of course, there's always the ground, but there's less obstacles on the wall itself. And so we start in this medium that in some ways is like kind of more dangerous to fall on. And then we progress and we get good. We get good in air quotes. And the terrain actually becomes to some degree a little bit less hazardous.
Totally. Yeah, it's an interesting paradox. And we've talked about this on the podcast before, in some of the earlier episodes. It's in the beginning, it's funny because you're starting out, you feel like, you should be able to fall more because you're a beginner, but you're on, like you said, you're on this terrain that is unforgiving. And you kind of really have to take that don't fall kind of rule pretty seriously. Because you could fall 5 feet, and like Max, you could run into a granite nub and break both your ankles.
Yeah, that's verbatim
You could
how I
fall,
hurt myself.
an extra 10 feet and hit a ledge. You could hit a tree on the way down. There's so many other objective hazards. And we've talked about, lead falls just get really big, really quick, with rope stretch, and maybe your piece rips. It's just like it can turn into a really messy situation really quick. And like you said, on an overhanging terrain route, as long as you don't hit the ground, you're probably going to be okay because you're not going to hit anything. But there's that gate of performance, that is holding the key to safety almost. And so it's a really interesting paradox that new climbers find themselves in. So yeah, it's a really interesting point that you brought back to the front.
Well, and just taking folks from the gym, going outside from like a manufactured landscape that's like literally a padded environment, like a physically padded environment, to this natural landscape that's like trying to hurt you. And they, and they just have this mentality of the gym, and they take it outside. And I feel like that can be sometimes disastrous, as far as like folks getting lowered off the end of their rope, right? Because a route is longer, right? Like that would never happen in the gym, or a ledgy route, or like an anchor that they can't find, or all of these other things. Like every time you add a level of complexity, you kind of just add more things that can go wrong. And so you need to have tools in your toolbox to be able to like deploy and safely mitigate those situations, right? So one thing that I talk about with folks is like everything that I teach, right? It's just like another tool for you to put in your toolbox. But then like you're gonna go out and you need to be the decision maker of to like which tool do you pull out and how do you apply it in your specific situation. And then like, I almost think of it as like a video game, right? It's like you can like unlock like the next level. And it's like once you learn the skill, then you can like go and do the next level. Um and that's like really rewarding. But if you don't have the proper tool for the situation that you encounter, it can lead to some bad situations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, you bring up a good point. I think that, especially trad, I think that it's so subjective and it's also so personal. Each placement that someone makes, I don't think, I would hope that the majority of people aren't just like brazenly placing placements and just like, fuck it, I'm climbing. I feel like everyone has their reasons. Everyone has a reason for the placement that they made. And, it's so subjective and so personal. And I guess moving like into this question, you have a social media channel, we'll put this link in the description. Have you had any sort of negativity or kind of like toxic behavior or elitist mentality in terms of judging your knowledge that you're sharing with people?
Yeah, certainly. And it's a really interesting point because the internet is kind of a great leveling of like the playing field, right? So like on the internet rectangle, everyone's voice is kind of heard equally. I mean, if it's on a post that I've made, I'm the curator of it. So like my voice gets heard a little bit more, but like, you know, I will often get comments from folks who are like, that's sketchy. I would never do that. Like, why are you teaching this? Like, you're going to die. Um, and part of that is because, the stuff that I post is intentionally trying to get people to think, right? It's like I'm trying to start a conversation. So like I'm posting things that are slightly controversial, right? Because controversy sells, unfortunately, for the algorithms of Instagram. And I love the haters because they make more comments and then it gets featured more. Like they're actually doing service, but yeah, it's interesting, right? It's like I could be this peer reviewed rock and alpine guide who does this professionally, and someone who just whatever their background is, right, comes in and just like says like that's sketchy, and I usually am like, well, why, right? Like let's talk about it. Like what like defines sketchy, right? It's such a qualitative assessment of anything, right? It's like, what don't you like about it, right? Um, and some of those conversations are really fruitful, and others just aren't. And I mean, I've got a long list of accounts that have just been blocked because they just don't deserve to have access to my content anymore. Um, and I'm totally fine with that. Um, but yeah, I mean, like that toxic behavior is so prevalent in our society today, unfortunately, just in things that transcend climbing.
I
um
personally find it extremely saturated in mountain project forums. Have you noticed that as well? Like, of all the forums and of all the spaces on the internet, it seems like mountain project forums are the breeding ground for shame, hate, and like just super judgmental climbers. I don't understand it. Like, do you have any insight to that?
yeah, I mean, I have certainly observed that and like gone down the rabbit hole of just reading back and forths between people well into the night of being like just invested in these arbitrary arguments that of people I don't know, just for amusement. I mean, it's unfortunate that it had to happen, but I think it's really kind of just, it touches on all the things that we talked about in terms of just stroking the ego and like the grades and like comparing ourselves to other people, and just our worth in the sport is only relative to someone else. And so I think Mountain Project being this open source resource, which is awesome. Like I love Mountain Project for what it is. But I also just think it's kind of this mouthpiece for people to just kind of verbal diarrhea from the safety of their own home and the anonymity of it. And, I imagine like there's probably a lot of people on there who are like a few beers deep and they're like making some of these comments and
Yeah, for sure.
rants. And it's really unfortunate that like the community has that side of it. Because there's so many great things in the climbing community and great people. And I don't think it really detracts from that, but it certainly is kind of like the ugly underbelly of the industry. And, I just look at like kind of the toxic, shameful comments that are on there as just a self-reflection on the person who posted it. It's like something they need to therapist about.
I think that it stifles the process of learning and inhibits people's encouragement to share their lessons that they've learned. We just had a free soloist who fell, Josh Urata, and he did an interview with Climbing Magazine, and he got lit up on Instagram and lit up on a couple forums about certain things that he did. And he really was super skittish and kind of scared to even talk to us on the podcast. And I think that that's so unfair because, squanching and stifling these people's lessons and their humility in sharing their experiences is super wrong and is detracting from the community. Because, like you said, we need to learn from our failures. And if people can't feel like they have a safe place to share their lessons online, then we're all going to be doing a disservice to ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I think that's really well said.
Awesome. I think that's it for me. That's it. That's all I got.
Yeah, I mean, we're an hour and 47 in here, so I think we got a lot of great stuff and a lot of great content here to kind of go over and everything. I just want to say, Max, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and stuff. And, I followed your Instagram account for quite a while. And thanks so much for putting out all the great material there and everything. And thanks for taking your valuable time to, speak with us today. It's really appreciated. And like I said, really great to meet you, man.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure chatting with you guys. And if you ever find yourselves in Colorado, I would truly love to go climbing with both of you. So,
man, I would love to make that come true. I really would in the next couple of years for sure.
Yeah.
Just so anyone listening, Max, your website is alpinetothemax.com, correct?
Yeah, that's me. You can find me there. Email, phone number, all that stuff is on there. And that's how folks can find me.
Perfect. And as mentioned, also Alpine to the Max on Instagram. Great account, lots of amazing content. So anybody listening, make sure you go over there and give him a follow and absorb.
Yeah, well, thank you. And and I'm always looking for inspiration from, folks that want certain topics covered because, it takes quite a bit to produce that stuff. So if anyone out there has some ideas of topics that they want me to cover, I'm always looking for that inspiration. So shoot me a message.
Yeah, we'll do. And I know if I have any controversial or sketchy climbing photos, I'll send them to you to get all the haters out.
I love getting that. Like I won't say frequently, but not infrequently either. I'll just get like random photos from folks with no context whatsoever. And they'll just ask like a question, right? Be like, is this safe? And I'll be like, well, what are you doing with it? Right. What's going on? Like, let's, and I think, I think that's just like, has like, everybody just gets tunnel vision and has this myopic view of like what's going on. And I think the last thing that I want to leave you guys with is just not to get tunnel vision and always look at the context, because the context is always so important. One of the things that I teach in my courses is like the only laws you're not going to break are the laws of physics itself. And so start there, like all of the acronyms like serene, earnest, all of that stuff kind of, I won't say goes by the wayside, but to some degree it kind of does, right? And so it's like the context of what we're doing is really important, and not to lose sight of the forest for the trees.